Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Very Cold Lasagna podcast, your place for all those filthy casual takes on the world of sports. I'm your host, DylanLasagna. This is episode number 193 of this icy yet spicy sports podcast. And in this episode, we're here to wrap up our NFL season recap month 2023. So it is the finale, the final part of our season recap month, March Madness, here on Very Cold Lasagna. So that is right, ladies and gentlemen, the final 7 teams that are to be covered here in our little March Madness. So 24 teams down, the final 7 to go. But wait, there's 8. You're forgetting one team. No, I'm not. No, I am not. We already done one way back in February. Go watch that episode after this one and all the other ones that you may have missed as well in our March Madness here on Very Cold Lasagna. But anyway, I digress. We're here to wrap up NFL season recap month 2023 here on Very Cold Lasagna in this episode. The final 7 teams that are to be covered. And I got to say, this season recap month this year, it's been hectic, crazy. But nonetheless, I hope you all enjoyed it. Whether my takes on each and every one of these teams have been good or to some of you bad or terrible. My analysis on them have been piss poor to you, especially to certain teams, per se. Derek Carr. But hey, at the end of the day, it's just my opinions, my analysis, per se. Because we're all casual, we're all fans of these teams. We all have the right to say what we want about these teams. And if you think that they'll do good next season, if you think that they're going to be great next year or this coming the past year, or if you think that they're great, I mean, that's your take on them. If I don't feel that they're that good, then that's how I feel. I mean, you have your right to say what you want about this player or this team. We all have a discussion. We all can have a discussion about it. We can all argue about it or whatnot. So that's just how we're gonna feel about it. This is, like I said, this is a place where we can be casual fans or hardcore fans. This is a space where we can just chill, discuss about the world of sports, whether it's football or wrestling or any other sport, if I ever want to talk about it. But anyway, I just wanted to bring that up. So as I said, my opinions on Derek Carr still kind of stand, for example, or any other things, for example. But hey, they can always prove me wrong. If they do end up playing better, for example, like a Derek Carr, for example, if they do have a better season, hey, my opinions will change. But if they still kind of mid, then it'll stand. So, hey, that's why they play the game, right? You got to prove me wrong. So anyway, let's talk about our NFL season recap month. Actually, before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping before we get the ball rolling here. Make sure you follow the show on social media, on X and Instagram at Very Cold Lasagna. And then for all my audio listeners out there, make sure you rate and review the show, whether you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, wherever you're listening to Very Cold Lasagna. And then if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you smash the like button, smash the subscribe button, leave a comment with your own takes on whichever episode of Very Cold Lasagna you're listening to. In regards to the episode topic that you may be listening to as well. And make sure you share this with your friends, share this with a stranger, share this with your buddies, your colleagues or whatnot, and spread the good or bad about Very Cold Lasagna. And then, well, now that Very Cold Lasagna's March Madness, per se, or NFL season recap month is all but done with after this, what's next? What's next for this podcast after this? Honestly, I don't know. I don't know, to be honest with you. It's going to be a slow period for sure, but I'll try to cook something up for y'all. I know WrestleMania is coming up real soon, but I'm for sure do not have any excitement as I did last year when I went to Los Angeles for that. But yeah, I just don't have any excitement for this WrestleMania in particular. Not to go on a whole on tangent about that. And then, of course, we have the NFL draft next month. But to be honest with you, like last year, I have not been, too keen on several of the draft prospects, but hell, we'll still probably do another Filthy Casuals guide on that again. But other than that, who knows? You'll just have to stay tuned with that very cold lasagna that you have in your hand in the fridge, tidy right next to you. So that being said, enough about the rabble. No, enough about all that shebang. Let's get into the final 7 teams that have made it close to the finish line. Actually, 6 of them in particular. But they once again had to bow down to the king. Da-na-na-na-na, da-na-na-na-na-na. They had to bow down to the king of kings in the NFL. So let's talk about these 6 teams. And then the one team that was once again hailed as the king of kings of the National Football League in the finale of our 2023 NFL season recap month. So let's begin our journey towards the end of our 2023 NFL season recap month by going up north to Green Bay, Wisconsin, to talk about the Green Bay Packers. So after 15 years or so with Aaron Rodgers under center, the Packers were ushering in a new era of quarterback full of love. Jordan Love, per se. There were bits and pieces, though, with Jordan Love as a starter when he had to fill in for Aaron Rodgers at quarterback when Rodgers had COVID the last 2 years. But for Jordan Love, this was his first real season as the man. Now I'm not talking about Becky Lynch, the WWE superstar who now has an autobiography out in stores now. But nonetheless, I'm talking about Jordan Love, the quarterback, the new starting quarterback for the Green Bay Packers. This was his first full season as the new head honcho in town after Aaron Rodgers was traded away to the New York Jets. But last offseason, there was such a long delay in getting such, and the Packers didn't really have much of an active offseason. And also, they have limited money to spend. So, considering all that, questions still loom large on how the new starter in Green Bay would perform in what many expected to be the start of a rebuild on the youngest team in the NFL. So, looking at this past season for the Packers, it started off pretty rough. Well, yes, it was expected considering that this was Jordan Love's first full season as a starter. He really gave their fans some doubt. Love was pretty inconsistent in the first half of the year. He had some stretches where he showed his potential of being pretty good, but then there were times where in certain games where his turnovers cost him the game. Like, for example, against the Raiders, the Broncos. During those stretches during the season, he would throw some pretty bad interceptions, like literally heaving it towards defenses that would just cost them winnable games. Now, it wasn't all Jordan Love's fault because the receiving core struggled just as much to pretty much connect with Jordan Love, pretty much with catching, running the routes. And then when you get to the month of November, you're staring at a 3-6 mark. And it looked like a lost season for Green Bay, looking at a high draft pick and all that. And another part of their struggles was the middling defense. Under defensive coordinator Joe Barry, who's been there for quite some time now, but he's kind of been a problem over the last couple of years, despite all that talent that they had, all those draft picks that they acquired and spent on defense. Still a problem in 2023. And the biggest problem of all this past season was giving up a lot of first downs, stopping the run, and giving up a lot of yards to several rushers, even allowing a couple of 100-yard rushers this past season. So another red flag for this Packers defense was their passing defense, allowing a lot of avoidable extended drives. And that wasn't helped by the case of trading away one of their top corners in Rasul Douglas to the Buffalo Bills mid-season near the trade deadline. So that left a major big hole to the person opposite Jair Alexander, their top corner. So you're looking at 3-6, and the season looks lost for the Packers before that Thanksgiving game against the Detroit Lions, and of course the game prior against the LA Chargers. So if you're a Packers fan, you were kind of worried about the development of Jordan Love and the status of his team, looking at the possibility of a high draft pick in the NFL draft a couple months later down the line. So it was getting worrisome for them. But when you look at what went right for this team, it was pretty much the stretch later on. And that was mainly due to the fact that Jordan Love took a big leap after those games. So like I said, they're sitting at 3-6, still struggling at home against the Chargers in that Week 11 game. And then I guess someone really lit a fire under Jordan Love's ass because he led a comeback against the LA Chargers, and then they started playing a whole lot better from there. They upset the Lions in that Thanksgiving game, and then they went on to play really good against Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs in that Sunday nighter. And then, yeah, they had a couple of speed bumps against the Giants and the Bucs, but then you saw Jordan Love throwing more efficiently and getting the offense a lot faster, more productive than before. And then when you look at the receiving core, being more in sync with Love more than ever, the likes of Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs, Devontae Wicks, the tight ends, Tucker Kraft and others. And then also helping out balance out the offense was the return of their running back, Aaron Jones, during the stretch after he missed 6 games. So this Packers team, that late season stretch, they really made a lot of people like me eat some crow for doubting them. So yeah, they went on a stretch to win their last couple of games and get the last NFC wildcard spot at 9-8, and they certainly had an interesting season. They endured a lot of growing pains this past year, but hey, you got to give credit to them and their coach Matt LaFleur for rallying together and making an unexpected run to the playoffs, and where they even made even more noise when they got there, because that's the 7th seed. And where nobody even gave them a chance. I don't think I even gave them a chance either. But they took that really personal. They took that as personal motivation, because when they went to Dallas to face the Cowboys, from the very start, they absolutely massacred their ass. So they massacred the Cowboys in the wild card game, and then the next week they played pretty good against the 49ers, and they just came very close and then just couldn't close the deal. They made 3 costly mistakes against the 49ers, one of them including a missed kick by the rookie kicker Anders Carlson, and then the game interception from Jordan Love. So their season ended in heartbreak, but the future is very bright for this Packers team. They're young, they're hungry, and they may have found their answer at quarterback in Jordan Love if he continues to spread, like I said, that love through the air. And yeah, I think they do have a chance to compete next season, not just for a playoff spot, but maybe even for the division title once again. So looking at their offseason so far, they have around $12 million to spend. They do have the 25th overall pick in this upcoming NFL draft in about a month or so. Looking at some of the key free agents before the free agency period started a couple weeks back, some of the key free agents included, not too many, which is good, always good for them. Running back A.J. Dillon, corner Keyshawn Nixon, and then safety Darnell Savage, who did end up going to the Jaguars. So looking at the moves that they already made, they did sign Raiders running back Josh Jacobs. So a key piece to their offense and a key support to Jordan Love. They did also re-sign A.J. Dillon as well. So someone had to be a casualty, and that casualty ended up being Aaron Jones. So Aaron Jones ended up going to the Minnesota Vikings right away. So interesting choice there. They also managed to sign Giants safety Xavier McKinney, but they also released one of their top tackles from the Aaron Rodgers days, David Bakhtiari, who did struggle to get back healthy after that NFC title game a couple years ago, which kind of sucks though. They also released linebacker Devondre Campbell, who did sign with the 49ers, so you do kind of have a need at that spot now. So looking at some of the needs that they have to address in this offseason as it rolls on, they do have to address the defense tackle position, because their run defense, like I said, it was a major weakness this past season. So they actually do have a valid reason to go defense in this draft. So they got to shore up that interior defense and find a way to stop the run. And as I noted, In the secondary, it was pretty weak. After they traded away Rasul Douglas to the Bills, and they did replace Darnell Savage with Xavier McKinney, they could still use some more help. Maybe they can draft some players at some key positions like safety and corner to ease the load off of McKinney and Jair Alexander. Add some depth. And then you can bring in another kicker. They drafted Anders Carlson. He was a rookie, totally understandable. But man, did he really struggle in the moments that mattered the most. I mean, like I said, look no further than that game against the 49ers in the divisional playoffs with less than 5 minutes to go. Could have went up 7, forced my team to try and force overtime, tie the game, but he missed it wide left with that amount of time left. Those kinds of misses will, and it nearly could have cost teams the game. Actually, did cost them the game, and could cost kickers their jobs. And it could have cost Anders Carlson his job, but they're giving him another chance. So the Packers should consider bringing in another kicker to compete with Carlson during camp if he can't get it done, if he doesn't improve. So for the Packers, after a supposedly rebuilding season that took them to unexpected heights, took unexpected turns, they look more than ready to compete for the division and more once again this coming fall. But as long as they can address the defense further this offseason, and they got a new defensive coordinator, and they put it all to execution alongside the rising Jordan Love-led offense, and he continues to progress, then the Pack will continue to go once again, and they can be back with an even bigger bang this fall. So let's go from Green Bay down to Tampa Bay as we now go onto the pirate ship that is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. These Tampa Bay Buccaneers, man, I really didn't have many high hopes from them in 2023 after Tom Brady announced his retirement for real because, the fake out that he did the year prior. But now this past last year, he actually did it for real after they lost in the wild card game to the Cowboys. So last offseason for the Tampa Bay Bucks, the remaining players left from that 2020 Super Bowl run either left in free agency or were released due to the salary cap. So the Bucks made do with what they had. They signed what they could. So one of those notable signings was a new QB in town by the name of Baker Mayfield, who, some of you may know him from the Browns, the Panthers, and most recently at the time, the Rams. And even with the new signing of Baker Mayfield on the Bucks, I didn't have many expectations for this team. I predicted the Bucks were going to be the worst team in a even very weak division as they began a rebuild of sorts. I think I had them at 5 wins. Yeah, I was that hard on them and during that time in the summer last year. So was I going to be right? Was I going to be wrong? Well, let's talk about this team in their past season. So for the Bucks, there's a lot that went wrong in their mid-season stretch because during the months of October and November, they only won 1 game after their bye week. So they went 1-6 during October and November. And although they started off really nicely, starting off at 3-1 to start the season, and they were playing very decent football. But after that bye week, starting off with the game against the Lions, they almost went 2 months without winning a game. So there were some problem areas with this team. But their key issue with this team was their inability to finish games in late situations. Like they either couldn't hold on to a lead like they did against CJ Stroud in the Texans, or they couldn't put together like a rally like against the Bills or the 49ers. Another main issue was they couldn't like score in the red zone when it was like right dead in the right. Like for example, that 49ers game I talked about in my recap of that game. They had 2 opportunities to get in the red zone, but they couldn't capitalize on it. So that was a major problem for them. And then another issue with them was their secondary, again, giving up a lot of big plays and points. Todd Bowles is a defensive head coach, but his secondary was really struggling out there, especially in the passing defense, specifically their corners. Carlton Davis and Jamel Dean, they've really dipped since the Super Bowl season. And, maybe I'm looking at the wrong tape, but it's like they really struggled. And the depth behind them is not any better. There may have been a good red zone defense, though, but they could have avoided those spots if the secondary wasn't an issue, giving up all those explosive plays. However, the reason why they've gone so far up to the point that they did was because, well, they turned it around in December. Despite that 1-6 stretch, the Bucs, they stood strong and finished strong to end the season. They finished 9-8, won the NFC South. Despite the Saints catching up on them, and the Saints actually splitting the season series against the Bucs, but they managed to pull out strong, win the last game of the season against the Panthers on the road, and win the division after nearly dropping it to New Orleans a week prior in a loss. And one of those main factors was Baker Mayfield's career-saving play throughout the season. Thanks to some better coaching from offensive coordinator Dave Canales and more experience throughout his time in the league, Mayfield went on to have the best season of his career, especially during that late season stretch. You have signature wins over the Packers and the Jaguars, especially that Jaguars game where he really went off. He helped save both the Bucs season and his career. So they finished the season 9-8, pretty much a reverse 180 on last season's record with Brady and the Bucs. So I mean, not saying much, but they'll take it in a very weak ass division. So they edged out the Saints for the division based on various tiebreakers, and they would once again host another NFC East 5th seeded team to close out wildcard weekend on a Monday night. This time, the Bucs faced the Eagles in a rematch of not just Week 3, but their playoff meeting two years prior. And Bucs and Mayfield exacted some revenge from Week 3 on Jalen Hurts and the Eagles. So they earned a trip to Detroit to face Jared Goff and the Lions, and they fought hard. They tried to stay in the game. They tried to win that game, but they ultimately fell short of the NFC title game in a tough battle. And it was a game where I thought the Bucs would have actually won that game, very near to the end. But their midseason issues crept up again, and Mayfield threw a pretty poor interception to end that game. But despite all that, the Bucs got much further than no one expected, and to be honest, they should be proud of that. But going into the offseason so far, they were awaiting a lot of uncertainty. There were many questions of whether they could repeat the success that they had this past year, especially considering there were a lot of players entering free agency, and they couldn't sign them all, even with the money that they had. So some decisions had to be made. So looking at their offseason so far, the Bucs had around $43 million to spend. Their first round pick this upcoming draft is the 26th overall pick. Looking at some of their key free agents, it was a lengthy list. But narrowing it down to the narrowest and keys of bunch, obviously the one at the top of the list to start off free agency for this team was quarterback Baker Mayfield. Were you going to re-sign them, or were you going to go with someone else? Another one at the top of the list was receiver Mike Evans. How long of a deal we're going to give him? And then some of the other key free agents were safeties Antoine Winfield and Ryan Neal, and linebackers Levante David and Devin White. White ended up going to the Philadelphia Eagles, edge rusher William Golston, and kicker Chase McLaughlin. McLaughlin ended up re-signing, so that's really good for them. At least they have a kicker now. Looking at the moves that they already made, Dave Canales, who ended up going to the Carolina Panthers as their new head coach. So replacing them is Liam Cohen as their offensive coordinator. They did re-sign Baker Mayfield and kicker Chase McLaughlin to 3-year deals, so they do have a long-term starting quarterback for Mayfield now. And they also re-signed Mike Evans to a 2-year deal. So it ensures him that he will play in Tampa Bay for the rest of his career, or maybe more, depending on if he wants to stay there. They also franchise tag Antoine Winfield and re-signed Levante David to a 1-year deal. They also signed Jordan Whitehead to a 2-year deal. So that pretty much means that Ryan Neal's not going to stay there. Ryan Jensen, their top center, announced his retirement, and I imagine he did such because he was struggling with a couple injuries ever since the Super Bowl year. So it really sucks. But hopefully he's healthy. He enjoys retirement, and bless him much. Now, looking at some of their needs that they still need to address this offseason for the Bucks, they got to make the secondary a priority in this draft. Now, they signed Jordan Whitehead and corner Bryce Hall as well. It still shouldn't be enough for this team because this Bucks defense is still problematic, especially in the passing department. They should use 2 of their draft picks to upgrade the depth at those 2 spots. And then looking back at the interior, the rest of this defense, they got to address the linebacker spots because Devin White and Shaq Barrett left in free agency. Barrett got released by the team, and Devin White's now in the Eagles. So they got to figure out how to replace these 2 key pieces from their Super Bowl defense. Do they go out and sign someone cheap, or do they find replacements in the draft? So 2 key pieces in that Super Bowl defense, and 2 key pieces still, in their 2023 team, gone. Looking at their offensive line as well, they could still surely stand to do better than the guards that they signed in free agency. And so they also have to address the center spot now that Ryan Jensen is retired. Now, they can't draft them all, but they should prioritize at least in their starting guard or a new center to bolster this offensive line because, it wasn't bad, but, they could certainly do better. So the Bucks, they surprised many with their 9-8 finish with a deeper playoff run than most expected. And yes, they signed a couple of the key players back onto the team to make that run possible. They still have a lot of work to do in the next couple months if they want to repeat their unexpected success from this past year. If they do, they could make another run at it. But now the problem is there's another team in the Atlanta Falcons that can make it even harder on them. So it's on the Bucks to bolster this team this coming offseason. So let's go from Tampa Bay to down, H-Town, as we now talk about the Houston Texans. 2023 was supposed to mark the beginning of a true rebuild for the Houston Texans. Now, after they fired head coach Lovie Smith, and because he left a parting gift in the form of purposely winning the last game of the 2022 season, that caused them to lose out on the first overall pick in the 2023 draft, the Texans went on to hire former 49ers defensive coordinator DeMeco Ryans. And DeMeco was quickly tasked with restoring the team from the ground up. And the Texans, they went on to have a very active offseason last year that included getting the quarterback that they wanted, despite not having the number 1 overall pick. And that quarterback was by the name of C.J. Stroud from Ohio State at number 2 overall. But they weren't finished there yet. They went on to trade back immediately into the 3rd overall pick. They traded from the Arizona Cardinals, and they went on to get an edge rusher by the name of Will Anderson from Alabama. So they got their 2 key pieces on both sides of the ball after an aggressive first round in that draft. And now that they have their 2 key pieces on both sides of the ball, a new head coach, it was now a matter of time of how the Texans were going to perform in year 1 of this rebuild. So when you look at the Texans in this past year, they didn't really get off to a great start at 0-2, which, it was expected with this young core, but they picked up steam over the next month or so. C.J. Stroud started coming into his own while picking up wins over the likes of the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the New Orleans Saints. And assisting me in this growth was a supporting cast of receiver Nico Collins and then breakout rookie Tank Dell, Steven Sims, and Dalton Schultz. So this supporting cast that looked like a nobody cast, it actually started really doing really well for this rookie quarterback and for the entire team as a whole. Defensively, they still had plenty of flaws, but under DeMeco's leadership and a couple of veterans, the defense took a step forwards with the mix of, like I said, veterans and youth. The likes of Will Anderson, Jonathan Greenard, Malik Collins formed a pretty good front, while the back end of Derek Stingley, safety Jimmy Ward, and the late season addition of Kareem Jackson, they made a very decent core for this defense. And what do you Combine that with, well, by late season, the Texans were a young and unexpected growing group that even with some of the key losses that they suffered during the season, they had a key point. They had a path towards making the playoffs. Like they were like nobody predicted that they were gonna make the playoffs in 2023. Like I said, this was supposed to be a rebuilding year for the Houston Texans. But once you get towards the end of the season, it was a win in game compared to 2022, towards the end of 2022, where both of these teams are just between the Colts and the Texans. They're battling for a top draft pick spot in the draft. But this past season, they were battling for a playoff spot. Like, no joke. These teams were a year prior, like I said, battling for a top 5 draft pick. And then this past season, they're battling to try to get into the playoffs. But in the end, it was the Texans that came out on top over their division rival. And not only did they get a playoff spot, they got something even better than that. The AFC South. They got the AFC South in major thanks to their other division rival at the bottom, the Titans. They upset the Jaguars the next day because the Jaguars, well, blame Tony Khan. No, I'm just kidding. The Titans upset the Jaguars the next day, and the Texans are AFC South champions. They made a good amount of history within the span of 2 weeks, going on to win the division and their playoff game against the Browns at home in runaway fashion, as they became the first team in NFL history to do such with a rookie quarterback and a rookie head coach. Pretty insane how 1 year is like a change, like a complete 180 for Houston compared to like the last couple of years for them. Unfortunately, what went wrong for them? Well, they did suffer some key injuries late in the season that did end up affecting them in their next playoff game. Like Stroud's top receiver in Tank Dell, he suffered a fractured fibula in week 13 in that it was the Denver game. While safety Jimmy Ward was also gone for that game due to an aggravated hamstring injury. So some of these injuries late in the season, like back in December, they started piling on, and it started becoming pivotal as the playoffs started rolling on. The Stroud also lost Noah Brown in the receiving game to a torn ACL in that wild card game. So combine that with a lot of missed opportunities, inexperience. When you get to the divisional game against the Baltimore Ravens, it just was too much to overcome, especially for a quarterback like CJ Stroud. Sure, he has a lot of promise, but he just wasn't at that point quite yet. And that led to their demise in Baltimore. They also had, like I said, deficiencies in certain areas still, like corner, defensive line, offensive line, among other areas in their young core. So the Texans, yeah, it didn't end the way that they wanted to. They were hoping to go on a very surprise run in the AFC Championship game, but they ended their season like nobody expected them to. 10-7. Many were expecting a rebuild. AFC South champions yet. And they went on to go on to the divisional playoffs. Not certainly an AFC Championship game quite yet, but the future of this Texans team, I believe it's going to be very bright for them. Probably much brighter than the days of the Deshaun Watson era under center. But if they want to get to that ultimate goal, which is their first ever Super Bowl, and actually, well, one step behind that, their first ever AFC Championship game, there's work to be done. There's work to be done to build around this young core. And man, so far, they're putting in a lot of work in this offseason. So when you look at this offseason so far for the Texans, there's around $70 million to spend prior to the start of free agency. They did have a first-round pick in this upcoming NFL draft. Why do I say did? Well, they did have the 23rd overall pick from Cleveland. And they also did have an actual first-round pick in the 27th pick, but that got traded to the Cardinals because of the trade up that they did last year because of the Will Anderson deal. And recently, the 23rd pick that they got from Cleveland, they since traded away to the Minnesota Vikings for their 42nd and 188th pick in this year's draft as well as a second round pick in next year's draft. So they basically have no first round pick in this year's draft. So general manager Nick Caserio is going to have to make that 42nd pick count since he no longer has a first round pick in this year's draft. So looking at some of the key free agents, edge rusher Jonathan Greenard and linebacker Blake Cashman, they went to the Minnesota Vikings. Defensive tackle Sheldon Ranklins, he went to the Cincinnati Bengals. Offensive lineman George Fant, he went to the Seattle Seahawks. Devin Singletary, who had a decent late season push, he signed with the Giants. Adrian Amos and Kareem Jackson, they remain unsigned. Dalton Schultz, Kaimi Fairbairn, and Noah Brown. So looking at the moves that they already made, that being the Texans, they did manage to re-sign Schultz and Kaimi Fairbairn to 3-year deals. They also re-signed Noah Brown. And they also traded for the running back, Joe Mixon from the Bengals, in return for a 7th round pick. So not too bad for Houston. They get a solid running back, and they hope to get some glory day production from Joe Mixon. And to replace Jonathan Greenard, they signed Danielle Hunter from the Minnesota Vikings, and they also got some more help on the defensive end as well. Defensive tackle Danico Autry from the Tennessee Titans, and linebacker Azeez Al-Shaair, a former player under DeMeco Ryans. So that Texans defense is going to be certainly one to watch next year. So some of the things that they still need to address this offseason is, well, still staying with the defense. The safety position. The Texans still have to address that spot. They either have to decide on re-signing Adrian Amos or Kareem Jackson. So maybe they're still waiting it out. Or they can go on the route of drafting one to help out Jimmy Ward, because Jimmy Ward can't do it all by himself. He needs some help. And then on the offensive side of the ball, they have to add some help alongside the offensive line, because as the season wore on, with the injuries piling up, it was apparent that the offensive line was really struggling. So they should use at least 2 of their draft picks, if not 3, to find some upgrades up front for C.J. Stroud, notably at right tackle and left guard. Or maybe if you have better spots for them, let me know. So for the Houston Texans, this was supposed to be a rebuilding year for them in 2023, but man, they rebuilt much faster than many expected. Getting a playoff spot, winning the division, this was not on their bingo card. Nobody's bingo card when the season started. So this team, I'm actually pretty excited to see them in 2024. They got a very good quarterback in C.J. Stroud, very good head coach in DeMeco Ryans, and these young Texans, they have a very bright future ahead of them. And I know the AFC South would be a competitive division in 2024, at least 3/4 of it. And if the Texans keep adding the right pieces this offseason, and C.J. Stroud has a very good second year, they could be in their very first AFC Championship game this fall, in January next year. So now let's go from H-Town to Western New York as we now talk about the Buffalo Bills. After 2 emotional collapses in the AFC divisional playoffs, it seemed like the pressure was higher than ever before for the Buffalo Bills to finally reach the Super Bowl in 2023. Last offseason, it was pretty mixed for the Bills. They improved their offensive line, but they lost a few key players on their defense, and they still had one recovering from a major injury and a torn ACL. That player being Von Miller at edge rusher. So, pretty mixed bag, but nonetheless, the Bills were looking to finally overcome the hump that I'd been talking about last year in their season recap and the preview leading up to this season. So, the Bills were looking to finally get past the hump that was the divisional playoffs, make it back to the AFC Championship game for the first time since 2020, and even further, for the first time in over 2 decades, the Super Bowl. So from the Bills, when you look at the positives for their season, it was that offensive line that they committed to last year in the offseason. So some of you may say, oh, they only added one notable person. That notable person being a guard from the Dallas Cowboys, Connor McGovern. Okay, fair point. But the protection for Josh Allen was, I'd say, slightly better. I mean, it's not the greatest in the world, but they gave him a little bit more time to throw. Maybe even more time to throw. than the season or two prior. So the offensive line definitely gave him more time to throw, gave him more time to make a better decision or two. So I'd say this offensive line compared to last year's and the year after that, before that, much better than than the season, the last season prior. And then when you look at how the season ended for the Bills, it was definitely a better way for them to end the season than how the season prior, how the season like leading up to that was for them, if you know what I mean. In other words, it was not pretty. It was not pretty for the Bills because during that midseason stretch for Buffalo, it was very inconsistent, like extremely inconsistent throughout October and November during those dry periods because they had a lot of good and a lot of bad and a lot of ugly. So a lot of really weird inconsistency with the team that's supposed to have high hopes. And then they had a lot of high hopes of going to the playoffs, but unfortunately, those hopes were on life support by week 13 when they have their bye week. Those took an extreme hit when they lost in overtime to the Philadelphia Eagles on the road. So they had to regroup after that loss. They had a bye week, and then when they came back from that bye week, they turned it around, beat the Chiefs, beat the Cowboys, and sure, some of those wins weren't always in the prettiest of fashions. Like, for example, against the Patriots, a week before they had to face the Dolphins, but they managed to catch up to Miami and beat them in a winner-take-all game for the AFC East in the season finale. And rather than travel to face Kansas City in a rematch on the road in the playoffs, they went up all the way up to the number 2 seed and faced the Pittsburgh Steelers in the first round of the playoffs. So all things considered, they were the AFC East champions again and were the number 2 seed in the playoffs. Unfortunately, that's where pretty much everything went to shit for the Buffalo Bills, because when you look at this team, it was pretty flawed. It was very, very flawed throughout the season, because the reason why they were in this predicament from the midseason stretch onwards, because, well, they just shot themselves in the foot one too many times. It didn't have to be this way. Like I said, they were on the verge of missing the playoffs 6-6 once they got to their week 13 bye week. And yeah, it's just how it was, though, because as is the case with the last 2 years, the coaching staff relied so much on Josh Allen to single-handedly carry this team all the way to the postseason that Josh Allen was just forcing everything under pressure, and especially those back-breaking turnovers that had been so prevalent in the last year, the last 2 years, and it just really hurt the team this year. And even with the change from Ken Dorsey at offensive coordinator to Joe Brady, it didn't really do much to neutralize that. You were still getting a turnover or two every single game from Josh Allen. And then looking at the defensive side of the ball, they didn't have edge rusher Von Miller for part of the season, and this defense was already like dealing with injuries like early on. They lost corner Tre'Davious White to a torn Achilles in week 4, and then defensive tackle Daquan Jones, and then linebacker Matt Milano was gone a week later. Jones was able to come back, but still, this defense was getting hit with a lot of injuries. So it was pretty brutal. It was pretty brutal. Then there's also some average to below average play from the secondary, like Micah Hyde, Jordan Boyer, Taylor Rapp, that back end middle of the defense. They've regressed in a big way. So this team, despite having a good quarterback and a solid supporting cast and some key playmakers on defense, there were a lot of flaws with this team, both talent-wise and mentally. And then when you get to that divisional game against the Kansas City Chiefs, despite all their flaws, they had a really good opportunity to win that game against the Chiefs. But like I said, they just shot themselves one too many times in the foot. But there's a very big moment in that game where they did it at the worst possible moment. The Bills had several chances to beat the Chiefs in that game, especially in a 5-minute drive to close out that game. And to even tie the game, mind you. But yet, when they got to the red zone, Josh Allen just kept trying to go for the kill, trying to go for the touchdown, but he kept on missing every time. He was like 20 yards out, and he tried to go for a bomb, and he kept missing. And then you have to go kick a field goal. And rather than, a couple plays earlier, you could have gone for a first down. But now you have to go for a field goal. The game's on the line, and you need it to go to overtime. But instead, everyone in the stadium, the Bills Mafia and Bills players are instead faced with two familiar words. Wide right. Yes, those two infamous words back in their very first Super Bowl were once again faced with it in front of their own very eyes at home. Wide to the right. That's because Tyler Bass kicked a potential game-time field goal wide right, and the Bills couldn't stop the Chiefs afterwards, and their hopes of a Super Bowl once again went down the drain in the semifinals. So you look at the Bills of 2023, and despite the roster holes, despite the flaws, it didn't have to be this way. And it's just frustrating if you're a Bills fan. Josh Allen, once again, just put too much on himself. He tried to play hero ball in the divisional game, and not just even in that game, one too many times. And they paid the price for it. And, it's not entirely Josh Allen's fault, because coaching is to blame. Like, there were situations where they didn't even have to be in that point. So it was just a little surprising that after that game, they didn't make a change up at head coach with Sean McDermott to try and help Josh Allen and a roster that is going to look different if it didn't get the job done. So it's a little surprising, but it is what it is at this point. So when you look at the Buffalo Bills, it's just like, now that you get the job done for like the third straight year, it's like, are you gonna get the job done with this quarterback, with this roster that's now gonna look different as the offseason is underway? I don't know. So let's look at the offseason for the Buffalo Bills so far, because yeah, it's not pretty. They had around $42 million in the red, minus De Niro in debt. So they had no money to spend. They had to make some cost-cutting moves. But before all that, they had the 28th overall pick in this year's NFL draft. And they had some decisions to make at free agency, like receiver Gabe Davis, who unfortunately went to the Jaguars, edge rusher Leonard Floyd, they had to let him go to the 49ers, Tim Settle at defensive tackle, who signed with the Texans, Micah Hyde, who remains unsigned. So some of those cost-cutting moves for the Bills included Nyheim Hines, Mitch Morse at center, corners C-Run Neal, and Tre'Davious White, and safety Jordan Poyer, all whom signed with various different teams later on. So all of them became cap casualties. And even that wasn't enough to get them under the cap before the deadline a couple weeks prior. So once they did get under the cap, they did manage to sign a couple players like Curtis Samuel from the Commanders at receiver, Mike Edwards, the Chiefs safety, Falcons receiver Mac Hollins, and they did re-sign a couple of their own players as well. But still, there's still plenty of things that they need to address if they want to get back and competing and go even further than the divisional playoffs. Like, for example, they need a number 2 option long-term alongside Stephon Diggs. Maybe Curtis Samuel can be that option, but the Bills should ideally use that first-round pick to find a long-term deep threat to complement Diggs, because we all thought Gabe Davis was going to be that guy, but unfortunately, he wasn't. He kind of disappointed this past year. He kind of was inconsistent. And then they need another edge rusher to replace Leonard Floyd. The Bills' pass rush was really lacking, with Von Miller struggling, coming off a torn ACL, and he's going to need some help now that Leonard Floyd's out in San Francisco. So maybe use one of those draft picks to draft another edge rusher to go alongside Von Miller. And then I don't know if it's a pressing need per se. Maybe it's a down year for him, but you got to consider looking into a kicker to compete with Tyler Bass, because do they really trust Tyler Bass in these big moments now after falling victim to Wide Right, the sequel? So I'm just saying, like, maybe they should consider looking into the very late rounds of the draft, or maybe in later deeper into the offseason to find a kicker in case of an emergency, in case Tyler Bass is continuing to struggle. Just pointing it out there. So the Buffalo Bills, they were once again hopeful to finally overcome the hump that was the divisional playoffs before the season started. They did win the AFC East despite all those rounds and glories, all those struggles. But unfortunately, they didn't. They didn't overcome the hump. And now they're paying the hard price for it for the first time under this regime. That is Josh Allen and Sean McDermott. Now, for Josh Allen, he's still going to have them competing next fall. But the rest of this offseason is just going to be telling of where the Bills lie in an AFC that's going to be, once again, really competitive this coming season. So now let's leave Western New York to talk about a team up north on the rise in 2022 and was even further on the rise this past season, and that was the Detroit Lions. After ending 2022 on a high note, I gave a very bold prediction, maybe not so bold now, that the Detroit Lions in 2023 were finally going to win the NFC North. And man, last offseason, Detroit didn't slack around, fixing up both sides of the ball to gear up to that goal, especially considering there is no more of that bad man in Green Bay to haunt them anymore. So going into this past season for the Lions, it was pretty much their division to lose, their NFC North division to lose. Like the Packers, they didn't have the bad man anymore. The Vikings, they still had plenty of questions despite, them winning the division last year. And then the Bears, well, it's the Bears. So anyway, it was basically the Lions division for the taking. And when you look at this Lions team, like, oh man, like I can kind of rave about this team, because when you look at this team, they took a big step forward, especially when you look at this offense. And some people say, oh, it's a little bit of an overrated offense, don't you think? But when you look a little bit deeper, this was a very kind of like balanced team at least on the offensive side of the ball. Under offensive coordinator Ben Johnson, the Lions offense took a big step forward this past year. Quarterback Jared Goff had his best year since his Super Bowl year in 2018 with the Rams, if not better. He's aided by a supporting cast of running backs Jahmyr Gibbs, the rookie, and David Montgomery. They formed a great 1-2 punch, especially with Gibbs coming along late in the year. And then look at the receiving core. Amon-Ra St. Brown, obviously, he's been the Lions' tough top receiving option. But then you have second-year receiver Jameson Williams. He had a sloppy start once he came off that 4-game suspension. That was initially 6. But late in the year, he started coming along, became more than just a downfield receiving threat, but they started using him more in different kind of dynamic packages. And then also, of course, you don't forget tight end Sam Laporta, who was a popular target for Jared Goff in this offense. And then last but not least, you have this very strong offensive line that was one of the best in the league in just about every aspect, whether it's pass protection, run blocking, and that was even with all the injuries starting to pile up later down the road. So this Lions team was actually very balanced on the road to where they were going. And that was their first ever NFC North title ever. So it wasn't the easiest path for the Lions, because they did have a little bit of a rough early stretch, a little bit of a loss to Seattle, and then a little bit of a rougher couple of weeks in December, despite a mix of wins and losses here and there. But they came out of their rut to beat the Vikings on the road, clinched their first ever NFC North division title, and they managed to clinch their first division title in over 30 years when the Lions were in the now defunct NFC North, not the NFC North, NFC Central division. And that meant they got to host their first ever playoff game in Ford Field and their first home playoff game in over 30 years. So it was the first time since 1991 that Detroit got to host a playoff game. Kind of insane when you think about it. Over 30 years since they got to do that. And kind of insane when they get to do it against their old friend, their old quarterback, Matthew Stafford, and his new team that they traded him away to, the Rams. and they get a win against their old friend Matthew Stafford. So that was just the cherry on the top for this Lions team, because the Bucs went on to beat the Philadelphia Eagles on that Monday night of that wild card weekend, and by virtue of that, Detroit got to host another playoff game, that being the Bucs. And it was a hard-fought battle between those two teams. And, well, the Lions fought them off to reach their first NFC Championship game since that same year, 1991. It's kind of a crazy season for the Lions. It's like, regardless of how far they went in that year, it was like, it was a really good year already for Detroit. But fortunately for Detroit, some people just wish it would have gone farther, because for the Lions, they almost got there. They almost got to their first ever Super Bowl. It's just there's one big issue. There were actually two big issues stopping them. And that one of the big issues was their defense. Their defense was just a huge liability, especially in the secondary. Even if it didn't result in touchdowns at times, their corners just gave up way too many explosive plays to put up them in such spots like in the red zone. But they either played too soft or miscommunicated a lot. And in the pass rush, outside of Aiden Hutchinson and defensive tackle Elaine McNeil, the front four didn't really get a lot of pressure on quarterbacks. And that exposed a lot of the secondary issues that I just mentioned. And then there's also head coach Dan Campbell. I mean, look, I actually love Dan Campbell as the Lions head coach. It's just that, his over-aggressiveness can really pay the price on this team. Some of that was evident when they lost to the Bears in Week 14, and there were a couple other instances too, like in that Week 2 loss to the Seahawks. So Dan Campbell can get a little too over-aggressive when he goes for it on fourth down. Like, he is like a very aggressive fourth down head coach. Like, he wants to go for it. And that was very evident in the NFC title game against the San Francisco 49ers. Like, they were up big in that game, 24-7 at halftime. And they were just one half away from going to the Super Bowl. And they all they had to do was make a big decision in the third quarter. Like, they had to kick a field goal, simply. But that was a fatal flaw. They made a fatal flaw mistake of going for it on fourth down in the third quarter instead of going for a field goal. They don't convert the fourth down, and that was the beginning of the end for the Lions, because that sparked the fire in the 49ers to begin their comeback, their rapid flurry comeback for San Francisco. And that also began a flurry of mistakes for the Lions as they squandered a 24-7 lead to the 49ers and eventually lost that game. So I know some will say, oh, the Lions again. And yeah, some of that was true, but it's just like, yeah, I mean, maybe that was a lack of experience in those big games, but it's just kind of insane. It's just like unfortunate that it ended on a kind of rough note for Detroit. So yeah, it was very tough, and also kind of familiar way for the Lions and their fan season to end in 2023. Sure. I mean, I would have been very upset had the Niners go on and lose that game. I mean, of course, as I said in my championship recap of that game, I mean, it would have been rough, but I still would have been, praising the Lions. I still would have given them their flowers because they played it. They earned it. They would have earned their way to the Super Bowl because of how they played, how aggressive they were. Because, they were at a point that they were like a team that went on an unexpected run to this point. And, wouldn't have been too far-fetched for them to upset the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. Like, it sounds crazy, but they would have had a pretty good chance despite their flaws on defense. So the Lions did meet some people's expectations in 2023, like winning the NFC North, but they met a lot more expectations by going even further than most people didn't expect. Even if they didn't close the deal, they put the rest of the NFL on notice by going to the NFC Championship game, going 12-5, and pretty much saying that these aren't the same old Lions anymore. So for Detroit to get back to this point of the NFC Championship game, it's going to be hard, but at least they know that they can do it. They can do it. So looking at their offseason so far, they started with around $52 million in cap space. They do have the 29th overall pick in this NFL draft, so they have to decide what they want to do with it, who they want to draft. Looking at some of the key free agents, there were a few notable ones, like Jonah Jackson at guard. He did sign with the LA Rams. CJ Gardner-Johnson at safety. Interestingly, he signed back with the Philadelphia Eagles. Kind of a choice there. Corners Emmanuel Mosley and Cameron Sutton. And receiver Josh Reynolds, one of the key receivers for Jared Goff. He went to the Denver Broncos. So looking at some of the moves that they already made, they re-signed guard Graham Glasgow, Emmanuel Mosley, and kicker Michael Bagley. They also traded for Bucs corner Carlton Davis for a sixth-round pick in return for a 2024 third-round pick. So they kind of addressed the corner spot that they needed to, because Emmanuel Mosley also got injured last year. And then in the interior defensive line, they also signed a tackle in DJ Reader from the Cincinnati Bengals, and an edge rusher from the Vikings in Marcus Davenport. So that defensive line kind of solidified of sorts, but they still need to fix that part. And that brings me to what they still need to address this offseason. And that is adding a long-term starter at edge rusher opposite Aiden Hutchinson. Now, like I said, they signed Marcus Davenport from the Minnesota Vikings, but Davenport has had some issues staying healthy, as evident with this one season with Minnesota and his later seasons in New Orleans. So until they can prove that he can stay healthy, Detroit should use one of its first 2 draft picks on finding a running mate for their star pass rusher in Aiden Hutchinson. Like, they have to think long term with this pass rushing group. I mean, at least one of the options, at least. And then they have to find a replacement for Jonah Jackson if one's not signed already. I don't think one's signed already, right? So the Lions, they have to address his replacement because, they need to continue to be one of the best offensive lines in the league. So they should find one if they haven't drafted one yet in the NFL draft. So the Lions, they took a big step forward in 2022, and they took an even bigger step in 2023 by almost clinching a Super Bowl berth, their first ever one in their franchise history. Now, I know it's a tough pill to swallow for Detroit fans still, because, even they acknowledge that this might have been their only chance to be there, to be in the Super Bowl and potentially win a Super Bowl, which could have been true considering the moves that made around the NFC so far. However, if they use the draft and the rest of the offseason to fix what went wrong in the title game, then Detroit could make a case of potentially going back to the NFC Championship game and finishing their story of getting to their first ever Super Bowl. And, call's crazy, but maybe winning a Super Bowl for the first time ever in Motown. So now let's leave Motown to go to the flock, Ravens flock, as we now talk about the Baltimore Ravens. Baltimore went to 2023 seeking a proper return to the playoffs after the last 2 seasons for them featured their starter, Lamar Jackson, being injured late in the year. And for at least last year, they didn't have Lamar Jackson in their first round appearance against the Cincinnati Bengals, and they were disposed of in the playoffs. So to get to that point of making the playoffs with Lamar Jackson, they actually had to address an important decision with them. What do you do with them? Because Lamar Jackson was a free agent last offseason, but the team franchise tagged him initially, and Lamar Jackson was not happy about that. He was not happy that, the team didn't really value me as a long-term option, as a franchise guy. So he requested a trade not long after. But the team and Lamar came together and signed a long-term deal just before the NFL draft, and it was a big, fat contract. Yes, big money, pal. So now it was time for the former MVP to prove whether or not he was worthy of such contract. After 2 down seasons, trying to deal with injury, and just not really living up to that play that he had in 2019, where he was the former league MVP. And boy, did Lamar Jackson really prove it to us. He really had a MVP-like year, and he actually did have an MVP year, because Lamar Jackson was on a mission like a super technician in 2023, having near perfect passing games almost every week, and finally possessing that balance of being a rushing and a pocket passing quarterback that I want to see before the season started. Because, we've seen a lot of Lamar rushing, but we haven't seen enough of him actually being a true passing quarterback. And he really did it a lot this past season. And aiding him and such were new additions to the receiving game, Nelson Aguilar and Odell Beckham Jr., as well as they drafted rookie Zay Flowers in the receiving game. So they got him some help around tight end Mark Andrews and their third-year receiver Rashad Bateman. So they had a stacked receiving core, and so finally some weapons around Lamar Jackson. And then balancing out the passing game was a strong backfield despite the injuries. Again, was Gus Edwards, Gus the Bus, Justice Hill, and the breakout rookie Keenan Mitchell. And then also helping out the Ravens offense was a very physical, league-leading defense. The Ravens were and played like a top 5 defense in the NFL right from the jump. You had a very physical front seven that included the likes of edge rusher Justin Madubike, edge rusher Jadeveon Clowney, linebackers Patrick Queen and Roquan Smith. All of them were able to get to the quarterback in a hurry, hit him hard, force turnovers, you name it. This group was physical. Like, they were hard. They were aggressive. They want to kick your ass if you were a quarterback. Meanwhile, on the back end of the line, they were not as physical, but they knew how to create some turnovers on you. Like safety Kyle Hamilton, he ran run shot in the back line, like scrambling all over the field. And then Marlon Humphrey at corner, once he made his return from some injuries, that back line made it difficult for defenses to throw at them. So, look at what else went right for this team. Well, despite injury mania, once again running wild in Baltimore Pal, they managed to overcome it. They actually managed to swing by it this time around. And they used their strengths to put those injuries to bed. Put together their best season for the first time since 2019, finishing 14-3 with the top seed, 13-4 with the top seed in the AFC since that same year in 2019. Now, unfortunately for the Baltimore Ravens, that's where things pretty much end. That's where things pretty much end for them, because, sure, you win the divisional game against the Houston Texans, but pretty much all those positives that I just talked about for them, those were pretty much wiped away in the AFC Championship game at home against the Kansas City Chiefs. So, a home favorite in Lamar Jackson, the Ravens, and all those things that I just praised you for, yeah, it was pretty much nowhere to be found against Mahomes and the Chiefs. The Lamar Jackson that was in the regular season, that was also present in the divisional game against Houston, he couldn't crack the code that was the Chiefs' defense, and he made 3 crushing turnovers in that game. And especially towards the end, when he was trying to score, he threw it dead in the right of 3 defenders. And meanwhile, you have the Ravens defense that had been very physical, that had been playing very well all year. He struggled to minimize Patrick Mahomes in the short passing game. They barely got to him. I think he only got sacked once in that game, if not at all. And in short, despite keeping it close all game, it was a very low scoring game. The Ravens just simply missed their opportunities to take control of that game, and they just fell one game short of their first Super Bowl since 2013. So for the Ravens, sure, it's good that Lamar Jackson had a bounce back year and he won the MVP to boot, but in my opinion, none of that matters if you don't get to the final duet in the Super Bowl. And Lamar Jackson cracked again when it mattered most. Actually, the whole team cracked when it matters most. When you're pretty much shutting people up, you were having this very good year for Lamar, and you're having a very physical defense, and yet you couldn't do anything with it when the lights were shining brightest on you in the AFC title game. With one game between you and the Super Bowl. So Baltimore does have a chance to make it back there and rewrite history. But once the offseason began, this team was going to look a little bit different. So looking at this offseason for the Baltimore Ravens, they had around $16 million in cap space. They do have the 30th overall pick in this upcoming draft, but they did have a lot of free agents. And they surely weren't going to keep them all. Like backup Tyler Huntley, who had been playing in place of Lamar Jackson for the last 2 seasons. Fortunately, in the case that Lamar does get hurt again, he's not going to be around for that because he signed with the Cleveland Browns. And looking at running backs, Dalvin Cook, J.K. Dobbins, and Gus Edwards, they were all free agents. Gus Edwards did sign with the Chargers. Receivers, Odell Beckham Jr. and Devin Duvernay. Duvernay signed with the Jaguars. Guard Kevin Zeitler, one of Jackson's key guards, signed with the Lions. Jadeveon Clowney also signed somewhere. I think it was Panthers. He signed with the Panthers recently. Linebacker Patrick Queen, he went to the division rival, Steelers. Ooh, man, that's a major loss for that defense. And then safety Geno Stone also went to the Jaguars. So some of those key pieces on that defense, in that offense, gone. Davino. And the Ravens, because they don't have really much money to spend, they were not able to replace them like right away. So they did make a few moves though. One of those moves they had to address right away because, well, their defensive coordinator in making that physical defense, Mike McDonald, he left to take the Seahawks head coaching position. So they replaced him with an internal promotion to inside linebackers coach Zach Orr. How Orr manages to put that defense together, how he does as a play caller, it'll be interesting to see. They did make a trade. Then that was trading away Morgan Moses, the guard, to the New York Jets in return for a 4th round pick swap and a 6th round pick in this year's draft. And they did make an interesting signing. They signed Derrick Henry from the Tennessee Titans, hopefully to bolster up that backfield, maybe to help out Keen Mitchell. So we'll see. And then they did re-sign edge rusher Justin Mudubike to a big fat contract. So other than Derrick Henry, I mean, they didn't really re-sign. They didn't really sign anybody to bolster out some of their key free agent departures. So looking at some of their needs that they need to address this offseason, well, is that defense. They got to retool that defense. So they need to address the replacement of Patrick Queen, first of all, because a key part of that front seven is gone. So they also have to address the passing defense that hurt them in the AFC title game against the Chiefs. So Zach Orr is going to have a big a big task at hand the rest of this offseason in retooling this defense. And that starts with the NFL draft. Like, what do you address first? Replacing Patrick Queen, retooling that defensive line, the secondary. Options need to be had here. And you also have to consider retooling the offensive line because the Ravens did have a good offensive line, good pass protection for Lamar, but they lost 2 of their starting guards in free agency. So they got to find some replacements for them. So when you look at the Baltimore Ravens, they had a really good regular season, and he looked like the late season Super Bowl favorites before the playoffs began. Hell, I even picked them to go to the Super Bowl as well. They were well balanced, and Lamar Jackson had the best season in 4 years. Unfortunately, it didn't translate to their biggest game before the Super Bowl. So the Ravens got to regroup and try again next fall, but they got to fill in those blanks first on some key losses in order to do so. If not, then it can be a struggle to replicate the success that they had this year. So now we leave the Ravens flock to talk about the final team in our 2023 NFL season recap month, and that is none other than the reigning, defending, undisputed Super Bowl champions of the world, the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs were fresh off winning Super Bowl 57 last year versus the Philadelphia Eagles, and they were a preseason favorite very early once it was over to make it back-to-back. Something that hadn't been done since the 2003-2004 New England Patriots. And, well, they tried before in that pandemic 2020 season, but unfortunately, they were thumped. by Tom Brady and the Bucs in Super Bowl 55 in 2021. So the Chiefs, to begin that quest, aside from a few additions and subtractions through free agency and the draft, they were still content with running it back with largely the same group to begin their quest to repeat as champions in this past season. So the Chiefs, actually, it wasn't quite as easy as they hoped it'd be, because they lost to the Lions in the season opener, and things were kind of shaky internally with this team, because sure, they won a lot of games throughout the year, but there were some issues. There were some issues with this team, especially on the offensive side of the ball, because, well, they were dropping the ball, and I don't mean that like in one way or another. I'm talking about like literally, they were literally dropping the ball, and who was literally dropping the ball? Well, it was their receivers. Most of their receiving core was literally dropping the ball. So I was kind of an issue with this Chiefs team before the season started. Like one of my key things that I was looking at this Chiefs squad, and that was the receiving core. They didn't really add any help for Mahomes outside of drafting Rashee Rice. In fact, they lost McCole Hardman and Juju Schuster to free agency. And I noted this in, like I said, my season preview for Kansas City, that they got by last year, like the 2022 season, by the way, but that they got by with second tier, third tier receivers on their way to the Super Bowl and winning the Super Bowl. But this past season, it might not work again. And for much of this past season, it didn't really work for the most part, because, well, receivers were dropping the ball left and right, and they really didn't make a lot of very catchable balls on must-cut first downs, costing teams possessions, forcing the team to punt, and sometimes it even cost them games, like very valuable games. Like, for example, the Eagles game in Week 11, that deep ball from Mahomes to Marcus Valdes-Scantling, like a very catchable ball, but no, he dropped it. And then the game to the potential touchdown from Mahomes to, I'm not sure who it was, in that Week 13 game against the Packers, like very catchable ball, but dropped it. And yeah, it was pretty rough. It was a pretty rough go for most of the season for the receiving core of the Packers. And then you have the pass protection for this Chiefs team. The offensive line, wildly inconsistent throughout the year. And that mainly stems from their tackles that they signed to replace Orlando Brown Jr. and Andrew Wiley, who were free agents last year. So they signed on Jawan Taylor and Donovan Smith to replace them. And yeah, it was a very rough go. And I get it. Mahomes is a great quarterback and all, but he cannot undo the crimes that his tackles got arrested for, like holding. They were holding a lot. And every time that Mahomes and the receiving, and at least the receiving work, got some pretty good plays in, they were called back because their tackles would not stop getting arrested from holding. So overall, I mean, like this offense, like it was getting by, but they were holding themselves back. And one of the only things keeping them in games and helping them win was their defense, and obviously Patrick Mahomes, of course. But the defense was one of the two strengths of this team. In a reverse of years past, where the defense was really bad, defense coordinator Steve Spagnuolo coached together a unit that went from one of the worst in the league to one of the best in the league, because this defense only allowed 20 or less points per game on most occasions. So this defense was actually really good, a top 5 defense in the NFL. And one of the key reasons why the Chiefs went on to have such a successful playoff run again was the emergence of one Rashee Rice as a key receiving option. Now, obviously, you have Travis Kelce, one of, if not the top tight end in the NFL. Actually, it shouldn't be disputed anymore that he is the top tight end. But nonetheless, he, even in a down year, he was this unstoppable force. And then you have second-year running back Isaiah Pacheco, another productive option in the rushing and receiving game. But when Mahomes needed a true downfield threat late in the season, they finally found one in Rashee Rice, who is pivotal in the Chiefs' 3 playoff games, especially on the road. And speaking of the playoffs, they fixed all their problems on offense. Like it was a flip in the switch. The Chiefs' issues like with dropping the ball, pass protection, like we were questioning that a lot. Whether it was going to lead to the Chiefs like falling down in the playoffs, possibly as soon as their first ever road playoff game in Buffalo. But that didn't happen. They cleaned up the drops. They cleaned up the pass protection en route to another Super Bowl appearance. So they went on the road against Buffalo. They went on the road against the Baltimore Ravens. So everyone pretty much, including me, that was doubting the Chiefs, we were all eating crow. We were all eating that dog dookie water. Once it was all said and done, as they made it back to the Super Bowl to face the San Francisco 49ers. And they did struggle to some degree in that game. And they made it a fight in that game. And it went to extras. They made it to an extra period in overtime. And, well, even if it took to that extra period, and even though the Chiefs went on to slowly and surely dissect my team, the Chiefs accomplished what they couldn't do in 2021, while also breaking my heart as well. And that was become the first back-to-back Super Bowl champions since those Patriots in 2003 and 2004. They beat my 49ers and become repeat Super Bowl champions. So they finished their story, or at least continue it. And of course, who couldn't forget all the Swifties that joined them along the way? Oh yeah, how could I forget? Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift. Their love story that started in week 3 and went on to become mainstream throughout the year. The main story in the NFL throughout the year. How could I forget that? But anyway, the Chiefs, congrats to them. Everyone doubted them. Everyone was hating on them, but they continue to prove why they're the king of kings in the National Football League, whether you like it or not. They continue to prove you wrong. They continue to show them what they can do, even if they don't have many options in certain positions. So now they're going to try to go for something that has never been accomplished in the National Football League, and that is a three-peat. 3 straight times to win a Super Bowl. So how are they going to get there? Well, they have to address some things in the offseason. So looking at their offseason so far, they have around $9 million in cap space before the free agency period started. They're picking last in the NFL draft, at least in the first round, as custom when you're the Super Bowl champion. So looking at some of the key free agents, obviously we're not going to be able to retain them all because of the little cap space that they had before the new league year started. Like for example, defensive tackle Chris Jones, guard Nick Allegretti, who signed with the Washington Commanders, safety Mike Edwards, who went to the Bills, Willie Gay, one of their key linebackers, went to the Saints, Donovan Smith, one of the problematic tackles, he remains unsigned. Tommy Townsend, one of their big punters, went with the Texans, and the running backs Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Jerick McKinnon, their backups, they remain unsigned. So Chris Jones, they initially franchise tagged him, but they went on to give him a big fat contract. They also re-signed linebacker Drew Tranquill. In an interesting signing, Matt Ariza, who was blacklisted from the league initially, but they later unblacklisted him after some allegations that got him kicked out of the league. And then they went on to sign Cardinals receiver Marquise Hollywood Brown. So Patrick Mahomes finally gets that second option outside of Rashee Rice. I mean, let's see if it works out or not. Actually, they didn't place the franchise tag on Chris Jones. They actually franchise tagged corner L'Jarius Sneed, their top corner, but they traded him away to the Tennessee Titans in return for a 7th round pick swap and then next year's 3rd round pick. So a glaring need that they need to address this offseason if they want to keep that secondary as good as it was this year. So going on to the needs that they need to address for the rest of this offseason, it is that secondary. Finding a new top corner or two because, trading Jerry Sneed seems kind of crazy. I know, I get it. They didn't have a lot of money to spend. They had to commit to someone, and that someone was Chris Jones. But yeah, they got to scout hard to find a new top corner to go opposite Trent McDuffie, because that secondary is going to struggle if they don't have anyone in that other slot. And then on the offensive side of the ball, at offensive line, try again at tackle. Yeah, exterior offensive line protection was very, very average. Like, actually, not even average. It was not good. It was not good for Mahomes. And the Chiefs did right by not retaining Donovan Smith. So the Chiefs need to use this draft to probably find a gem at right tackle. And last but not least, add some quality depth at receiver. This is going to be an ongoing theme for Kansas City until the Chiefs staff actually address getting Mahomes some actual weapons outside of Kelsey, Pacheco, Marquise Brown, and Rashee Rice. So I get it. Like, they've already released someone like Marcus Valdes-Scantling, but like, you can't go into this this season under their title defense expecting to get by with an on and off again receiving core. It's like, no, actually get Patrick Mahomes some help. Like, just commit, address the receiving core, and if you want to actually go for a three-peat, get the man some help. Get the man some help. So to cap things off, the Chiefs proved once again in 2023 that even if they had a down year of sorts in their title defense, even if the regular season was not what they were expecting, well, it didn't matter in the end. The playoffs were the real season for them because they flipped the switch and they proved once again they are the NFL's king of kings. They will break your hearts and they'll be swift about it. They will for sure address the remaining pressing needs this offseason as much as they can. And as we learned this year, don't doubt Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs. They have a really good chance to make even more history this coming year, and that is trying to become the first ever, the repeat Super Bowl champion in NFL history. Like, really, don't doubt it. And with that, that is a wrap on our 2023 NFL season recap month. Another season recap month in the books, ladies and gentlemen. Our March Madness here on the podcast is over and done with. And I hope you all enjoyed it. Or maybe if you didn't, that's okay too. But nonetheless, 31 teams are done and recapped for the year. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly had fun with it, even though sometimes it was stressful. But the stress, it may have been worth it, right? I think it was. Nonetheless, like I said, hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, leave me your takes on all 31 teams, and including these 7 teams that I talked about in this episode, whether it's in the comments on YouTube, or send me a message on social media on X and Instagram at DylanLasagna. So now all we do for us football fans is wait for the season to begin. It's September, and we continue along this off season. So yeah. I also hope you stick around for what's next to come here on Very Cold Lasagna as well. So, yeah, stick around, pal. Stick around. But anyway, that is it for this episode of Very Cold Lasagna. I am your filthy casual host, DylanLasagna. Thank you for tuning in to this episode number 193 of this icy yet spicy sports podcast. Again, thank you so much to each and every one of you that has commented, liked, subscribed during this month of NFL season recap month, and stick around again, like I said, for what is to come here on the podcast, the YouTube channel, whatnot, as we continue forward our journey. That is Very Cold Lasagna. Anyway, until then, keep that lasagna very cold in the fridge with your takes on the world of the sports. And until the next one, peace out.